Disclaimer, the purpose of this is for me to watch in 1 year and see how things planned out. And opinions are opinions, not facts. Lastly, timestamps are in the description. Why I'm interested. Originally I played Classic for its entirety, leveling 5 characters to 60, experienced every raid and dungeon, and socialized with so many people. I loved all of these aspects even if it weren't perfect. Going into TBC, so many people said that it was a great expansion since it expanded on every aspect of vanilla and improved upon it. So, I went into TBC with high hopes, but to me, eventually the game just got boring to the point where I was only raid logging for the entirety of Phase 1, whereas in Classic I was always online. There was nothing I was interested in staying online for in TBC. Heroics weren't fun, and no value to me whatsoever really. I already had the previous alternatives, so I didn't really need to do heroics at all at that point, and the zones were just too ugly for me to enjoy questing in them, so when I was trying to do alts, it just wasn't really that exciting for me. So as I just kept logging on for 4 hours a week, it was just not worth the money, so I unsubscribed. When I heard about this classic fresh or season of mastery, I feel like this could be a huge positive for me. The season of mastery. From the name, the season of mastery, my assumption is that it's going to be reset like every year, like seasons in game. Like from examples like League of Legends or even that cash cow example private server called Ascension. Really good, I would say, really good examples there. And if it resets every year, it could be very interesting and keep it fresh, because that's what made Classic fun to me at least. Um, I'd imagine this is happening due to TBC being under Blizzard's expectations, I would say. Without this, TBC would just continue trailing down that slope anyway, and the Classic era would still be dead. Because the servers are just dead as hell. This is a really good thing for it, I would imagine. This clearly makes Classic more of an option to play, and it's clearly aimed at the ones that left TBC, I would say, and who still enjoy Classic. Some wishful thinking, though, I would say would be achievements to go along with this. I know a lot of people probably would agree, and a lot of people would disagree, but imagine seeing like a Season 1 player who's achieved so much in the first season, and then it's already like Season 6 and you've seen that player join your raid, and it could just feel like a special moment, like to see a veteran of the Season of Mastery. Like, I'm thinking in the long term at least, so that could be a good thing. And overall, I would say I'm interested in that aspect. Uh, for the 12-month cadence, I would say this is probably due to that many people just flatline ignored WoW until the next phase came out because they already achieved their BIS. To me, this also created some annoyances with like guilds because they tried to like replace a bunch of pugs until their main people would come back later in the next phases. Originally, Classic was almost like 2 years. This will likely keep those people who leave until the next phase, since it won't be that long for them really on that phase timeline. On the other hand, though, it could possibly shove away the busier people, as they won't really have too much time to catch up. Some wishful thinking, I would say, about that would be increasing the amount of loot in raids. I remember um, Scott J watching a video from him. I remember he mentioned that, and I would completely agree on that type of aspect because there's 40 people in a raid, and within a 2 month timeline, there's at least about let's say like about 7 to 8 raids, and if you're trying to gear them up, it's going to be hard, especially since like the loot is so random and the loot is so scarce as it is. Imagine, for example, the loot pinatas in BWL. Firemaw, Eben Rock, and uh, Flame Gore or something, I can't remember the third one. But those only dropped like 2 items each. So if you think about it, like 7 to 8 raids, there's going to be about like, I would say 16 to 18-ish like drops from them. And a lot of them have really good items for like tanks, melee DPS, and of course healers as well. And casters, there's a huge amount of lists, but if it's just so scarce, and considering the time frame of being in, like, let's say BWL for like 2 months, it's not really going to last that well. So increasing the loot table would definitely help out in that regard. Um, Another wishful thought I would say would be to shorten the phases that aren't really major, so that way you could allocate more time for the other phases. For example, you could shorten phase 4, which is just ZG and the the world bosses. None of them really have like BIS forever, really. A lot of the bigger raids already have equal amount or better yet, better items than what ZG has to offer or the world bosses do. So in terms of that, you could just lower down that phase as just a mini like phase, so that way you can give the rest of the phases, like the bigger phases, an actual time for people to start gearing up properly. Overall, I do like this though, because in a sense it just allows for more people to stick around instead of AFKing all the time off of their like subscription and not doing anything. So that does help out. So the phase difference. So let's say the only phase difference there, as you can see, is just the honor system and battlegrounds, which is moved from phase 2 to 1, and the battlegrounds from phase 3 and 4 to phase 1. If they stuck with how they developed it in the original release, so many people wouldn't bother, as phase 2 went really badly with so many people being camped at the flight paths for honor. This will eventually be a huge help in the PvP side, as it will basically mean so people won't be forced to camp flight paths just to get their honors, so that way they can get up in the ranks quickly, and they can just do battlegrounds instead and maximize their potential in um, Arathi Basin, which I remember being the biggest one for like spamming honor, and I would say that would be a huge help in that regard. Another thing too would also, it would help out so they don't actually piss off the other side of their community, who don't really care about PvP that much, but like they get forced into that PvP situation. Like on PvP servers, even though it's like a PvP server, some people don't prefer to like do world PvP all the time. They prefer to do a lot of other stuff as well as world PvP. So I think that will just make it less toxic overall, and it will also help combat those who try and kill great NPCs to annoy the other faction. I know that was prevalent in Classic and in any other type of release of WoW. So that will help out tremendously with that, because it will combat them giving like a dishonorable kill, and we all don't want dishonorable kills if we're doing PvP. So that would be at least the upsides to that. A downside, though, could be seen that as more rank 14s will exist, making it less special to a lot of people. Because, like it was more of a rare thing seeing a bunch of like rank 14s together, but there'll just be way more now. However, I don't really see too much of a downside. I would imagine a lot of other people would be. I mean, you could probably see the upside being that rank 14 people can finally get it in this 12-month period, since it's in phase 1 instead of phase 2. If it was in phase 2, they wouldn't be able to do it because it would take way too much time, and by the time they get it, they're probably already replacing some of the gear with AQ40 and next gear, which would just demean their entire like progress of getting rank 14 in the first place. But you know, it is what it is with that. Some wishful thinking again would be to have no decay at all. Um, I saw this used in the private server Darrowshire when I was trying out that during my, I would say, break from TBC really. And it seems like a pretty neat design choice. You know, it never really made sense for me that someone could kill thousands and thousands of people to attain their rank as a high, like, um, officer in their faction, really. And then they just get deranked because they take a slight break. It doesn't make sense to me. Um, Even though it's got decay, man's still gonna try to get rank 14 anyway. Chad Rogue, you know what I'm saying? So that's it for the phase differences. Um, so if we go over here, we can see world buffs in raids. No world buffs, to be precise. It's obvious why they would be doing this. It's because the raids were literally a cakewalk with world buffs. They were literally no sweat whatsoever. Like you could clear out Ragnaros with like the shortest amount of time ever. You wouldn't even know if you had a first phase at that rate, and that was a problem to at least a lot of people, but not to all, because I'll explain in a minute. But without this, people would spend hours like to get their buffs for raids and log out to save them, and then they would easily stomp the raid. The upsides to this is that the raids will be more difficult to knock down. Um, but like that's without the world buffs, of course. And I know a lot of people would like world buffs, but a huge amount of people, way more people, would not like the world buffs. So it's kind of like a topic. There's so many like forum posts about it, even to this point. And but it's getting a little bit controversial, but I personally see it as a good thing regardless. Um, but back on topic though, the upsides would be like obviously it'll be more difficult to knock down the bosses because you know they last longer, which means that you have to like probably gear differently and stuff like that, and play the fight differently. Um, it would help puggers as well to join a raid and not feel forced to get world buffs. I know like as a pugger on like one of my characters, it was definitely a difficult situation to get like into a raid without a world buff. So you always had to get like the massive world buffs, like the major ones, like the heads, the heart, uh, Diamol, Tribute, and Songflower and stuff like that. There was so many that you had to get just to be considered into the pug raid really. And then regardless, they'll probably wipe, and then they'll just call it halfway through. Um, but yeah, there was that. And it can really change the gearing meta of each class possibly, like favoring sometimes MP5 just to stand for longer with your mana bar, considering the fights would be longer and more straining on your mana, and it may consider like you using even lesser ranks than you normally would. So it's a definite possibility on that regard. And it would also be nice that you don't have to waste hours of your own time just to get the world bus at the correct time in order to log off and not play the game until the raid. There is only two downsides I can think of this though. One of which being that speedrunning guides, not guides, guilds, speedrunning guilds will hate that they won't be able to speed through it as fast as they could do with the world buffs. And another would be that classes like rogues and warriors won't be as strong nor feel as powerful. Some wishful thinking would be to have separate, I would say separate versions of raids, one for buffs and one without buffs. It sounds silly, but imagine the buffed one giving you pretty much no gear whatsoever, like nothing, other than a timer and gold, so you can still have that speedrunning aspect. It's just that you don't really have the gear like that you get from it. Whereas like the non-buffed would give you actual loot, just a thought. But you know, I mean, no world buffs in raids is just a decent start, I would say. Overall, I'm happy with that. So restored um, mechanics that were removed early on to some raid bosses. If there were mechanics removed, it would be great to bring them in and make them more challenging. Obviously, Classic is a cakewalk, so if you make the bosses even harder, that'll just make it even better. So there's nothing that you can really say against that, really. Um, no boss debuff limit. I'd imagine they're doing this more to allow classes to use their entirety of the kit. Um, Kit such being like I don't know, warlocks and shadow priests and hunters and stuff like that. But without this, you'd have a list in a lot of hardcore raids, sometimes even in pug raids, really. But like you'd have a list of what debuffs were allowed, and if you pretty much used the debuff they didn't want, then obviously you could either be called out for it, you could be kicked for it. Like it depends on the raid leader, but of course it's their choice and their like rules in the raid, really. And it may seem a bit toxic to some, but it's what you signed up for, I guess. And with without that type of mentality, I think it could probably at least make the raids a little bit less toxic when it comes to what you can use. Um, this definitely, I would say, it would definitely help with the debuff classes that um, can offer more stuff now, really. Um, because they were restricted before. Classes like Warlock, Shadow Priest, Hunters, even, I don't know, Balance, Druid, Moonkins, that sort of stuff. Um, I would say the downsides, though, would be that the fight would go quicker and they would have to offset that. But if you see below, they already mentioned that, really, by increasing the health. Some wishful thinking, though, would be to have debuffs that stack to allow for more, like Shadow Priest, for example. Because from what I remember in Classic, you can't really have more than one Shadow Priest unless you want to be inefficient, because the Shadow Priest debuffs literally cancel each other's out, so that they'll be literally screwing each other over in damage and everything, which would be a good idea to allow for more Shadow Priest in raids if you wanted that type of meta. But overall, I'm happy with this. No debuff limit. Increased health on buffs to offset the debuff limit, of course, as addressed from a downside from before. Increasing it will just like help out and make the fights a little bit better, and it won't make it as a fast like boss kill like before. Overall, I like this. So next up, um, I'd say next up to talk, let's say the TBC styled leveling with focused quest increased XP. Notice that it says focused on like quest XP, so I would imagine it's likely just going to be the same leveling experience, but the quest XP is just increased. So like killing mobs is the same, I'd imagine, and killing dungeon mobs as well is probably the same. Although I'll get back to that later. But I'd imagine this is because of the 12-month cadence 100% though, as the shorter time frame to get to Nax, etc., etc. So if this weren't happening, there would be a lot of people who would miss out on the phase content, and as they're behind the pack, really. Not to mention they are mentioning mainly quest XP, so it would basically mean that this is more focused towards questing rather than boosting, which again I'll explain after. But The upsides to this, I would say, would be that questing would be more viable for alts during season rather than just being boosted, and it will be a decent time for it to get up to 60 for the first phase, considering the shorter time frame. And the downside I can probably see with this is that your journey is smaller, so in the leveling, which is a big part of the game. Like I would say, like a huge part of the game is leveling, of course, but as long as they don't increase it further to like, like what they had in the later expansions after TBC, then overall I'm happy with that. And meeting stones converted into summoning stones. Now I don't know much about the stones, but I'm pretty sure they were there even in Classic. It's just that they can't be used in Classic for some reason. Like they were just there, they just didn't implement the feature to use them. So I'd imagine they're just doing that because they just weren't working until TBC, so they're just gonna bring it in now. Before this, everyone would just have to walk to the dungeon unless a warlock was in your group, which did make a warlock special, I'll give you that. The upsides to this being, of course, you don't have to wait 30 minutes for a random player you invited to the dungeon to move his or her ass to the dungeon, but he's just AFKing at the goddamn mining node, I would imagine. Um, but however, this could make people a lot lazier and not even bother to move because they know that two people are on their way to summon them from the stone. This happened in even TBC. Like I saw so many people in in our dungeon groups that just wouldn't move their ass to the dungeon. They could fly there in like 10 seconds, but they literally can't move because they just want to be summoned. And I even saw that in my guild. So many people would just not do it and just not move. It just make them way too lazy. And one last thing is that you kind of lose that niche from warlocks that have that type of ability. Like it's like if you take the portals, it's like if you added portal rooms in like classic, then you'd lose a niche from the mages. Most classes have a niche, so if you remove it, I don't know how those classes and how the people play them will feel, and how their economy will feel after that. But it is what it is. Overall, I'm mixed with it, but it's okay. Increased nodes, I would say this is probably due to that population that they mentioned underneath this, but without this, I would say like nodes were usually tight to get, and the economy was inflated as hell because so many people were dedicated to just getting them on a daily basis and not allowing any others to get it, which means that they had the economy in an inflated area at all times, really. And it happened for quite a while until it finally died down when more people finally got some more nodes in, I think, like one of the phases, because I remember they increased the spawn of like those flowers as well. But overall, I could see this as a pretty good upside to the economy in the late game, really, for the high-end reagents like mining and herbs and stuff. This could only be really good, really. And lastly, I'm gonna touch on the mage boosting nerfing. Um, Mage boosting definitely had an impact on alt leveling and the economy. Without this, the majority would just go to mages to boost their alts instead of leveling in the open world because it was faster and they didn't have to do anything. They just had to sit there and just get levels, which, you know, is great, but it's not how the game was intended to be designed, that's for certain. The upsides to this would be finding people for dungeons would be easier, as they're not people aren't getting boosted, which means that more people are more willing to do dungeons, which would be great. The economy won't be so fucked as well with bijous, coins, and epics, such at like low prices and stuff like that. Like I like low prices, but it comes to a point where like bijous are only like a gold, when really they should be like a high price because they give you such a decent amount of rep for ZG, like ZG rep, which in turn can give you some pretty good enchantments and also potions as well, I'd imagine. Um, but yeah, solving the economy from this as well, alongside the alt leveling, would be a huge upside. The only downside I could probably see is that mage boosters will not be happy with their reason to play being gone, really. I for one have also leveled a mage to 60 and boosted a bunch of ZF and stuff like that. I didn't do like the high end Moradon and ZG, but at least I tried at least. But overall, it was really fun to do, but I wouldn't say like it was necessary for me since I had like other characters to deal with. But I can see why people enjoyed the mage boosting. I just don't think it's necessary. And that, of course, is my thoughts really, and what I think about this season of Mastery. I'm currently waiting for the beta to release, so that way I can play as a rogue and just chill and just level up and see how things go, see how the TBC leveling goes on the season of Mastery, and see what the differences are and stuff like that. Overall, I don't know how this is going to go, but we'll see. And that's it. That's my thoughts, and hopefully in the future I come back to this and then just say cringe or something like that. Or saying this was a perfect example of what happened. Yeah, thanks for listening, I guess.